Hey everyone, I'm here with Jason Archer and we are going to start talking about EBVs right from the start. I've just learnt about them. What are they?
What are they? So an EBV is essentially, well, it stands for estimated breeding value, right? And that pretty much says what it is. We're trying to work out how good an animal will be as the parent of the next generation. So it's a tool to find which bulls should we be using, which heifers should we be selecting, how do we breed the best next generation.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
And so what things are going into it to find that out? Like it's pedigree, right?
Yeah, so it does two things. So one is, so if we think about our performance data, say like a whole lot of weaning weights or something like that, so there are some systematic things that are nothing to do with the genetics of the animal, but they affect its weaning weight. So for example, whether it's a bull calf or a steer calf or a
Yeah.
heifer calf, how old its mum was. So, if it's out of a mixed age cow, it's going to be heavier than if it's out of a heifer. And then which group of animals it was run in, so its management conditions, and they're all going to affect the weaning weights of the animal, but they're not, when you go and buy a bull, you don't buy any of that. He doesn't pass that on to your herd. So the first thing it does is adjust for all of that so that we put everything onto a level playing field.
Yeah.
And then comes the pedigree.
Yes.
And so that's sort of saying, well, in essence, it comes down to here's a bunch of animals by this sire and here's a bunch of animals by that sire, and these ones perform better than the other ones. So that's at its real simplest level, and we do get a lot more complicated than that under the hood, but that's really, in terms of understanding, in terms of what drives it, that's really what it comes down to. So it's relationships between animals, which is the pedigree, and how those, and what it's essentially doing is tracking how those performance levels relate to the pedigree to find, okay, these, based on that pedigree prediction, this is going to be the best animal.
Cool. So probably before we even look at this, it's really important to have our breed objectives from our own property in place before we start digging into these.
Absolutely, because we need to know where we're going to go.
Yeah.
And so that comes down to what traits are driving profit in our business. And it's not just profit, right? It's cost as well, and also convenience. So, who wants to be pulling calves in the middle of the night? So,
yes.
So there's a whole lot of things that we want our cattle to do, and then an EBV, that I've just described as a generic tool, but it's a tool that we then can apply to say, okay, here's a trait that we want. So it might be calving ease, or it might be growth rates, or it might be marbling or something like that. So we can apply the same basic principle to all those different traits.
Yeah, and then I'm thinking about what I look at. So we've got our set of EBVs, and we've also got underneath, we've got accuracies. What are they?
So an accuracy is a number which gives us the, essentially it estimates how close to the real breeding value of that animal this number will be. We never know the real breeding value of the animal, right? You'd have to progeny test a sire with 10,000 progeny to know exactly what the breeding value of that animal is going to be. We never know it, but we know how much information is going into the estimate, and so we can predict to say, well, okay, at 85%, there's not much chance of that EBV changing as we get more information, whereas at 50%, we're saying, yeah, we know quite a bit about that animal, but there's still a lot that we don't know about that animal. It's less accurate, but really that's worth looking at. But the best thing is to get the best EBV.
Okay, and then because you've got the hereditary portion, is that going a bit too deep for what we're doing today, do you think?
Oh, no. So heritability is really just how much of what you see in an animal is explained by its genetics. So some traits, like carcass traits, tend to be what we call highly heritable. So probably 40 to 60% of what we see, the differences between animals that we see, are due to the genetics in those traits. Whereas something like reproduction, there's a whole lot of non-genetic things and quite random things that can happen that influence reproduction, and so the actual genetic influence on some of the reproduction traits is 10% or less sometimes, which means that when we measure reproduction on an individual animal, we're getting an indication of how good it is, but it's only a pretty inaccurate indication. What we need is a whole family of animals measured for these low heritability traits. Whereas if we measure something like marbling on a carcass, and on a steer progeny of a bull, for example, that is more heritable, and so therefore that piece of information is telling us more about the genetics of the animal.
Okay. And then the other thing, I'm just looking at the front page in my head, and we've got the percentile bands is another thing that we can click on. So what does that tell us?
Yeah, percentile bands tell us where that animal ranks in the, in this instance, New Zealand Angus population, right? So it's telling us, if we looked at the whole population, and it's based on a recently yet born cohort of animals, so the current group of animals out there, if we look at the current population, if we're at the 10 percentile band, we're in the top 10% of the breed for that particular piece of information.
Yeah. Okay, so that leads me to my next question maybe. So because I'm used to looking at the Angus New Zealand ones, the set of EBVs that I'm looking at, is the Herefords looking at the same thing, Scimitar's looking at the same thing, Shorthorns, is their names of their traits the same?
Yes, yep.
But you can't compare them to each other.
That's right. So, and that's the case at the moment anyway. So they're produced at the moment from the same system, from breed plan, and there's a standard set of traits and the same measurements that go into them, and the same technology goes into predicting them, same methods, but they're all done in isolation from each other because the databases are in isolation. So Angus EBVs are only comparable to other Angus EBVs, and Herefords are only comparable to other Herefords, etc. So yeah.
But I can compare them to other Angus that are in that same system. Is that I can compare mine to another stud down the road?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And that all works because across the whole population we generate what's termed linkage, but it's basically we're using similar bulls or the same bull in your herd and the herd down the road, and so that gives us a genetic benchmark. So we're saying from the same genetics in there, it actually helps us measure the management differences and account for them essentially. So it all, that's the glue that makes it hang together, is the fact that we're all using a similar set of sires, and that way we can start benchmarking everyone against each other.
Yeah, and then though we've got the indexes.
Yep.
But does every breed have different indexes, or are they the same too?
At the moment, yep, they're all different. Although there's similarities in what they're trying to achieve. So the index is basically saying, it's setting up a production situation and saying, look, if I am producing animals, I'm selling them at 20 months, I might be selling them to a market that does value some marbling, so there's a marbling premium in there, for example, and my cows are performing at this level, then what's the economics of all of that? But each breed has chosen that set of circumstances slightly differently to suit their customers. But probably most of the maternal breeds will have something that's for a self-replacing situation where you're breeding heifers as replacements. They'll probably have something where there's a marbling premium, and these days probably most of the breeds are producing something which might also say which is the best bull to use across dairy cows for a beef on dairy type situation. Yeah,
no, that's cool. And so that was probably most of what we did in a basic form, but we are going to drill down to this. So keep look out for our next episode, and we'll get a bit deeper under the bonnet, like you said, eh?
Sweet.